Over the years, with the introduction of absentee ballots, early voting in person, countywide voting, machine voting, we've added so many layers of complexity the citizenry can't understand. And what you can't understand, you can't control. And what you can't control, you can't audit, you can't fact check, you can't really trust. So out of all of this, it's not precinct voting just for precinct voting's sake. I mean, we talked about the advantages, or it's not election day only voting just for its sake, and we've talked about the advantages. But in the big picture, taking the complexity out of elections is really sweet, because then I think more people will get back involved and engaged, and they won't be cynical, they won't be distant, they won't roll their eyes when they show up to my polling place and ask me point blank, how do I know that this machine is going to count my ballot the way I marked it? So a lot of cynicism in the system right now. Complexity is not necessary. And I want to add this as well. One of our state senators used to be known for saying, we want to have easy to vote, hard to cheat elections. Now, let me just tell you, those two things do not go together. Easy to vote has never been a virtue. Easy to do anything really is not worth doing it. Our country was fought for, our Constitution was created at a very high cost, very high price. Our country was almost divided in a civil war, and the president kept it together, paying a very high price. Things that are highly valuable are worth the effort and worth working for. So easy to vote is kind of insulting. But I'm just going to say again, you can't have easy to vote and hard to cheat. Easy to vote, easy to cheat, okay? So take the complexity out, and I won't say easy to vote, but it's not going to be hard to vote, and it won't be hard to count. It won't be hard to tabulate. It won't be hard to do election night reporting. If you decentralize and you take things back to the lowest form of self-governance to the precinct, you get more people involved. And I really could go on, but that's probably enough said. Preeti, you might want to add to that a little bit.
Yeah, and the funny thing, we all know that actually some people will be in line forever. I know my dad, he's a diabetic. He was like in line to vote, and there was a really long line. And you're doing all this effort. People want to vote, and yet we already know that, I worry that, gosh, they're taking this effort to vote, and we can't trust that their votes are being counted. And that's all we want. We want to make sure that the voices are heard, that the elected officials are a real reflection of the people's voices, and that's the whole point of this. And so even the system now isn't so easy, and also it takes sometimes weeks for data to come back. So they might be trying to say it's easier with the machines and easier with the system they have, and actually it's not. And so I think if it's going to have some, if it's not going to be super easy, and it's going to be it might take a little bit of effort, but at least we want accurate, trustworthy elections.
And it doesn't have to be complex. We want it to be, we don't want it to be complex. We want citizens to be able to understand it and to be able to take part in it and have some responsibility towards it, and increase the accountability for the outcome, and therefore increase the level of trust.
Another issue of the Irving Herald is off the press. First copies of Irving's newspaper were distributed the very day lots were auctioned off to start the city of Irving.
Our topic today is precinct voting versus countywide voting. What happened in the March primary? And we are welcoming two experts on the subject of elections who have had vast experience when it comes to elections in Dallas County. I'm going to give them a brief introduction, ask them to introduce themselves and describe further their role and experience in elections. But joining us, we have Dr. Preeti Malati, who is a surgeon with over a decade's worth of experience practicing in North Texas, and Beth Biesel, who's a grassroots activist with involvement in party committees and on the statewide level as well. So please tell us more about yourselves and your experience in elections in Dallas County.
Why don't I let Beth start? She's been doing this a lot longer than I have, so.
Okay. I actually got into this sort of accidentally, but I was about 17 years ago very interested in integrity because I heard some things, saw some things, and I thought, well, I've got to get involved. So I started about 17 years ago working as first a clerk for a couple of elections and then shifted to an election judge for election day. And in Dallas County for early voting, I served as a judge, as a clerk. Also, as you mentioned, have been involved throughout the state as well as nationally, and learning what other states do around the country. But my experience as a judge, of course, gave me some insight into things that were quite surprising. I was a first-hand eyewitness to what I would say would be either an outside or inside manipulation of voters, voter names, and or votes. And that has continued to be a problem. It's not gotten better. So I keep showing up as an election judge, hoping that maybe I can be part of the solution. But time is young, I guess. There's more opportunity out there to fix things, and here we are. So, Preeti, this is where you come in.
Okay. Well, yeah, my background's very different. I was probably, like many people, very unaware of issues with elections. And I was not very politically active at all. And so I just voted every 4 years. I didn't vote in primaries. And then I remember the issue with Russia interference in 2016, and then them talking about air gapping. And I thought, oh, okay, it's air gapped. So then I just kind of put it out of my mind and I continued forward. But then in 2020, I think there was a heightened awareness of potential issues. I think in the political sphere, people brought this up with COVID, with mail ballots. And so I started to pay attention. And, I like numbers, I like technology. I've some background in electrical engineering and technology consulting before I went into medicine, so I kind of started paying attention. And when I started paying attention, I started noticing all the issues that started coming up from various states, some of the data that people collected, some of the lawsuits, the evidence that was presented and then ignored. And so I became more and more concerned. And sort of when you see it, you can't unsee it. And, I like truth. I like a level playing field. I want accuracy. I want our voters' votes and voices to be heard accurately, right? And so I just couldn't turn away. So I wanted to educate myself more. And so I decided, let me see if I can understand how the political parties are involved in this. And if there's a way through that avenue, I can learn more and maybe affect change. And so first I just became a poll watcher because I wanted to see how it works. I just had been a voter. I didn't know. And in Dallas County, all the votes go on USBs to a central location for counting. So I poll watched there to see where this is happening. And it was a very big eye opener. And then I have been an election clerk, an election alternate judge. I worked on different initiatives in Dallas County and with the Dallas County Republican Party, and that's kind of where I am. So I really try to educate myself in different avenues so I have hopefully a good perspective and some knowledge base to speak on these topics.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're going to be talking about this one issue of elections, precinct voting versus countywide voting. But before we dive into that and the context of that, which was this attempt by the Dallas County Republican Party to run elections more securely in the March primary that we just had. But before we get to that, if you could talk briefly and generally, based on your experience and your research, about what you're seeing with the problems in elections. So what are the issues with elections? And then what are we trying to get to? What system would be preferable to what we're seeing now? So what are the problems, and then what are we trying to get to make elections better?
There's a long list. There's a long list of what the problems are. So I'll just jump in, and I know Preethi's going to chime in. And I'm glad you mentioned central count, because I didn't say, with all my years of experience working as a judge or clerk and a little bit as a poll watcher, I was never involved in central count until I did one recount, and my eyeballs popped out of my head. I had no idea what happened there in central count. And so I hope we can, well, I'm sure Preethi will tell you some of the serious problems there. But problems just in the process of voting, early voting is a problem, mail ballots are a problem, and then the machines are a problem, because you can't see what happens in the machines. And I think a way to summarize just those three things is we have outsourced every aspect of our voting process. We've even outsourced voter registration database. We've outsourced voter check-in. We've outsourced tabulation. We've outsourced election night reporting. And so when you outsource all of that to third parties, these third parties are not subject to FOIA request or public information request. When they sign contracts with the counties, they can tell the county in the contract, when you go to test or certify our equipment, you can only test or certify, or you can only test within certain parameters. You cannot test outside of the parameters that they give you, or else you'll violate the contract. It's like violating the warranty. So there's no transparency. There's no accessibility. And then what we found out is there's actually no security, meaning security from outside intrusion or even inside manipulation. There's absolutely no security. Chain of custody is really, really bad. From the time the ballots leave the print shop when they're printed to when they go to the election department, then when they get out to the actual vote center for voting, and then when they go back as voted ballots. Chain of custody is a whole nother big problem. Early voting is a big problem for many, many reasons. There's just such a huge, huge exposure to manipulation because you're voting over 12 days, some states over 45 days, and it's really hard to secure that sort of opening to accessibility to your ballot. And then in Dallas County, early voting ends on a Friday night. They have all weekend where nobody really knows what's happening to the ballots when those early vote ballots come in to central count. Preetha can talk about that. And then election night reporting. What we have found in Dallas County, and I know it's true for many other counties, is that the precinct numbers add up to a county number. And then the county number is supposed to add up to the Secretary of State number that's reported. But what the county reports is not the same as what the Secretary of State reports in Texas. I can't speak for other counties. So every aspect, the voter rolls, I've heard it said before that cleaning the voter rolls is like sweeping a dirt floor. They're shifting all the time, changing all the time. And they're on a centralized database. It's on a network that is accessible to outside intruders. So your voter registration database, your check-in, poll books, your, as I said, your tabulation, your election night reporting, they're all exposed. So they're not secure and they're not transparent. And as a poll watcher or even as election judge or clerk, you really can't do anything about it. You're just pushing buttons, the buttons they tell you to push. That's all you know and all you do. And I think, okay, I'm running a good election, but I really don't know because I'm just pushing buttons. I could say more, but let me let Preeti chime in.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you. Oh, your microphone, Dr. Malati. There you go.
Sorry, there was some ambient sound that I was trying to avoid. So from a slightly different perspective, when I was kind of going into this and I wanted to understand it myself and see, can I look at the data, look what's out there, and convince myself I feel comfortable with how the process is running or not. And if you think about this, when we look at an election, we can look at number of voters and we can look at number of ballots. We can never see how people voted. That's anonymous, right? And then that also, in the way we're doing it currently with machine voting, that's in the machine, it's opaque. No one can see how the votes are actually voted. It's in the machine. Now, there are paper ballots. They're very difficult to go get to do a recount. We can talk about that later. There are paper backup in Texas. Not everywhere does that happen. So it's in the machine, opaque. We can't see it. It's proprietary. No one's allowed to see the code. No one's allowed to look into the machines, okay? So we have really no idea how those vote numbers come about, okay? But we potentially know number of voters, number of ballots. So I thought, okay, let me at least kind of look at all the reporting that is legally required by the county and by the state to look at number of voters, number of ballots, and everything needs to tie together at a precinct level, at a county level, at a state level. And every time I've looked at what is supposedly produced by the county and the state, the numbers never tie together. They're always off. They don't reconcile. And there's never a good explanation for those things from the governmental entities. And so that in itself leads to questioning. And people always say, hey, we always use, we use apps on our phone and online to do our finances, to do our banking and all of that. And, we don't worry about the software, worry about that. But I always tell them, well, you can go look at your finances. You'll know if you've added money in and it's not coming up on the system. But in elections, it's very unique in that the voter and the votes are divorced from each other because of the anonymity. So once it's in the system, you can't track that anymore. So it's a very different system and a very different ability to track. So anyway, none of the reports really add up, and they're not necessarily from different sources. They don't seem to be the same. So that in itself gives you a heightened sense of worry, right? So that, I would say, that in itself is a bottom line problem. And then we can go on into other issues with centralized counting.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because I want to get to the system, like what would be preferable, and also what the Dallas County GOP was trying to do. But maybe we can define our terms before we even do that. So early voting versus election day, those are two terms, just so people know. That's the period of time when you can vote before the last day you can possibly vote, which we still call election day, even though there's this whole run-up. And you were mentioning there's this gap in between that. You mentioned the term voter rolls. I don't know if you can define that term. What do you mean by voter rolls?
Yeah, I mentioned that. So there's a voter registration database. It's the database of registered voters, voter names. But we don't have any way to check to see if those names are associated with real people. But some of the checks that we have done have found that these people are either dead or they're inactive. They're still in the voter registration database, but they're inactive, meaning they haven't voted for several years, but they haven't been scrubbed. And I'm told that voters are never actually scrubbed. It's just that there's a field where their status changes. And so, and I'm digressing to part of the problem. So let me get back to voter registration database. The county has a voter registration database. The state has a centralized voter registration database. And sometimes as a judge, if a voter comes into my location and I can't find their name in the poll book either paper poll book or electronic poll book, I would call to the county and I would say, can you help me find this person? And they would look on their database or they would access the Secretary of State's database. And as I said, the name is always there, the status of that particular name. Maybe it's in suspense. That's a term that would take probably too much time to explain just right now in the moment. Inactive, dead, eligible, not eligible, or even eligible after a certain date. And our law says you have to register to vote 30 days prior to the election you want to vote in. If you register within that 30-day window, you can't vote in that election, but you can vote in the subsequent elections. And on your voter registration card, it'll say effective date. And what's interesting, this is a bit of a digression, but I've discovered in this last primary election, I had some voters come in during early voting, and that is the period of time where you can come in prior to election day voting, and that's the only day that is prescribed by our Constitution. In this case, in the primary, it's March 3rd. I had voters come in prior to that during early voting in person, show me their voter registration card, and it said effective March 3rd. This is the first time that I've actually been able to override the system to let them vote in early voting before their effective date. I've never been able to do that before. And then one more thing about the voter registration database. Voter sends, or a citizen sends in their registration application to be registered to vote, and then someone has to do data entry to put that name in the voter registration database. So the voter has to, or citizen has to submit their application within 30 days. But the county and or the state can update the voter registration database, which is the same thing as what we call for short voter rolls. They can update that any time within that 30-day window prior to the election, even during early voting and the early voting period, and even during the election day period. So if you're watching the voter registration database during the election, either early voting or election day, you'll see the number of registered voters climb. And that's troublesome because you cannot audit an election, which is at a specific period of time. You can't audit that election if the voter registration database, the voter rolls, is constantly changing. You need a fixed voter roll. It needs to stop at a point in time. So it's fixed, and you say, for this election, I have X number of voters. So I shouldn't have more than that number of ballots. And I could have less, of course. And by the way, I've also seen during early voting and election day voting, the voter registration database decrease, the number of registered voters decrease. Sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down. That's weird to me. And there's no plausible explanation.
Okay, wow, very interesting. What about this term central count? So what does it mean to say central count? What is that? Your microphone again, Dr. Malati.
I'm sorry.
Oh.
Just the ambient noise. So because in Dallas County, we count our votes in a centralized location. So historically, people would vote in their precinct, they would count the votes in their precinct, and they would have a result for a precinct. So you'd have precinct level results. And then those results would then get aggregated together into a county level results. Okay, so you have the breakdown, the granular level, and then it built up to a central number. But now the way we are voting is that we have no idea what the precinct level results are, but the votes get taken to a centralized location on USB drives, okay? The paper ballots go, but the USB drives are what is driving the actual votes. And those go to the centralized location. They are uploaded to a central computer, and then that puts together all of the results from the vote centers. So that's what central count is. So those USBs go there and gets aggregated together in a computer, and then the results are published.
Okay, so yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think this might be a good time. Forgive me for interrupting. You would have no way to know to ask this question, but Preethi's talking about these flash drives going from the precinct or the vote center over to either a regional drop-off site or the headquarters to drop off those flash drives, and that's where you're supposed to tabulate, to get your tabulation numbers. Well, in one particular election for early voting, the flash drive for a particular vote location at a church ended up in the Ziploc bag that was labeled for one of the community college locations, and the community college flash drive ended up in the Ziploc bag for the church. And I happen to know personally the person who put the flash drive from the church in the church's Ziploc bag. So it was not a matter of being mislabeled. Something happened in that transition where there was obviously no chain of custody. Somebody was doing something with those flash drives and got them swapped. So you asked earlier about some of the problems. That is a problem.
And kind of piggybacking off of that, when you talk about a centralized location, when we're trying to track a ballot, you start looking at every point where the ballot goes, okay, from when the voter votes on a voting machine, and then they take their receipt or their paper ballot and they stick it in the tabulator at the vote center. Most people know about that. Well, the tabulator at the vote center creates the USB, and it creates it off of the barcodes off of the paper ballot. So it's not really the selections, it's the barcode. So we can't read barcodes, so we don't know exactly what's on the barcode. And there have been examples of places in different states and different places where that barcode's incorrect. And that's very difficult to figure out if that's incorrect. And that's where the votes come off of, from the barcode and the tabulator, and then it goes onto a USB. And then the USB gets transported to the central location and then uploaded to this other accumulator. So when you're starting to look, you have to look at where are all these points of changes, points of where is the chain of custody going, and then all of the issues that can happen at every single point, right? And the more you centralize counting, the more likely you have problems with that chain of custody. And then, of course, within the machine itself, we don't have visibility into chain of custody. Whatever's happening to these numbers within the machines at each point, at every machine, we don't know what the chain of custody is. We've lost it. We can't see it. And so it goes to a centralized location. So having a centralized tabulation system in itself is problematic because of chain of custody issues, particularly.
And do you remember, Preethi, I don't know if you were working in Central Count, but when Tony Pippin's Pool was the election administrator, that means the person who's over the entire elections department for Dallas County, and that office is under the county clerk's office. When she was running a particular election, I wish I could remember the year, 44 flash drives were lost. 44 flash drives were lost. And there was some court order, and we all went to court. We wanted to throw out the election and have a redo. The judge says, not, just, we'll give you 10 days to find those 44 flash drives. They found them, 10 days later. I don't know which flash drives or whose flash drives or what have been done to those flash drives, but 44, that's a big number. That could swing an election.
And that represents thousands of votes. It represents thousands of votes that we have no idea the chain of custody. We don't know we can't verify what those are, but it represents thousands of votes, thousands of voters, so that's kind of scary. But hopefully that explained a bit about what central count is.
Good. Yeah, it does. Thank you. So talk about the context of this precinct level voting shift in the March primary. So what was the Dallas County Republican Party trying to do? Talk about the idea of a separate primary versus a joint primary. It's part of getting towards this larger system of secure elections. So what does that look like, and how was the county Republican Party trying to get there?
I can start with this, I guess. So when we're looking at the overall arching goal, the goal is to create accurate, transparent, secure, verifiable, accessible, simple elections, right? And there are different principles that you look at to get to that goal. And one of the principles has to do with what we're talking about, precinct-based voting. And what that means is voting within an assigned area, and your precinct's assigned to a certain vote location, and you cannot vote all over the county, okay? As a person from a certain precinct, they need to vote in a certain location. Countywide voting, which is a more recent phenomenon for election day, is where a voter can go anywhere in the county at any vote location. They can pull up their particular ballot for their precinct and they can vote there. So voters are all mixed and mingled. Their ballots are all mixed and mingled throughout the county. The assigned vote location allows us to, from a data standpoint, to be able to accurately, hopefully accurately isolate issues, investigate issues, tally numbers, and hopefully discreetly look at it in a granular level before it becomes centralized in terms of the counting. So that principle is very important. In addition, it's community-based. A lot of times, the voters are their neighbors, the judges and clerks who work the polling location are neighbors. And so there's a lot more trust there, a lot more transparency. And then again, the data can be kind of isolated in a granular fashion, and the ballots don't get commingled amongst all the ballots in the county. So it helps with auditing. It also helps with if you had to do a recount later, rather than having to go find ballots all over the county for, let's say you have a limited election that's only, it's a precinct chair election, or it's a certain state house race that's only going to be certain precincts. Well, all of the races, you have to go open boxes. If you're going to do a hand count of paper ballots, you have to go open boxes all over the county. Have to open all of those boxes to find those voters and votes. And it becomes very chaotic, and it ends up not being trustworthy, because there are all sorts of anomalies you find. But if you can kind of isolate it and keep it very segregated, it's easier to validate it later.
Also, in addition to what Preeti was saying about the community-based voting, the precinct voting, or precincts, let me say it this way, precincts are the fundamental lowest level of government. And I love what the founders gave us. One of their virtues or ideals in governance was decentralization. And, I think they wanted to get so far away from a monarchy, they decentralized the power. So the precinct level, anything, precincts for a police department, or precincts for voting for your elections, having a precinct as the lowest form of self-governance, empowers the precinct chair, which is an elected office, and it leverages that precinct chair's ability to engage the citizens in his or her precinct, to motivate them, activate them, get them to the polls, whatever it is. And there's a lot of power in that. There's a lot of wisdom in decentralizing pretty much anything, but particularly your vote, because, as Preeti said, there is a greater level of transparency, and much easier to audit if you're doing a recount, or just spot check or whatever. You're not having to grab all the ballots for the whole county and trying to find just a needle in a haystack. And I can't resist. I have to throw this in. There was a recount of a state office just recently, and I was a poll watcher. And so it was countywide voting, but this was one small House district. But you got to pull all the boxes from the whole county, and you got to go through every little box, and you got to find District 108 ballots. But here's the trick. The machine printout said, for this race, in this precinct, in this location, you should have X number of ballots. So you're going through these ballots and yep, this is 108, yep, no, that's another one, yep. And when you get to that number X, then they tell you to stop looking. And you're like, but there's more ballots in the box. I just want to go through these ballots to make sure that there aren't some extra ones in here. No. Yeah. And they'll tell you in a recount, it's not an audit. You have to, this is just a recount. So there's a number, you just stop there. So this is getting into the weeds a bit, but it points out there's so many vulnerabilities. But back to precinct voting, I love the way the lowest form, but the most powerful form of self-governance is right there in the precinct, empowering and leveraging the chair to activate, to get in touch with, to connect with the voters. You cannot do that with countywide voting at a countywide vote center. You cannot do that. So, and then one last thing, I was the election judge on March 3rd, where we did have precinct voting. And I'd been doing precinct voting from 2009 up until 2019. And it was such a pleasure because you get to know, as a judge, I get to know the voters. They know each other. They're standing in line, chit-chatting with each other. How's the family? How's the kids? What about that soccer game or football game or whatever? Well, we lost all that with countywide voting. And, you wouldn't change a whole country on, well, everybody loves to talk about the soccer game or, their grandbaby or whatever. But it was kind of nice. But I, as a judge, I knew my voters. And if some strange, person came in, well, then they're probably not going to be able to vote because I'm going to catch them. And of course, I'm going to look at my poll book too. But so 2019 was the first countywide vote center that that Dallas County had on election day. And I was a judge. You lose all that. But March 3rd, it came back. And honestly, it was so fun to see the joy, the happiness, and hey, has Steve come in to vote? No, I'm going to call him right now. How are you? I mean, there was that community engagement, and people, I think, don't really appreciate that as much as they should. But community engagement, knowing your neighbors, there is a very high value there, and particularly as the world gets crazier and crazier. Now, really, I'm in the weeds, but knowing your neighbors and being involved in your community, in your precinct, is powerful. And I do think that there is something very nefarious and intentional to take us away from that. But like Preeti said, no transparency, no auditability, and no ballot privacy. Now, did you talk about that, the ballot privacy, Preeti?
I haven't, but I wanted to go back to something you had said just to make a comment, and then I wanted to go back to answering. I don't think I had answered fully Phil's question, but what you said about the recount. And, since we have gotten to computerized voting systems, best practices of this is to have a paper ballot, paper trail. And everyone says, hey, you need to have that so you can do a recount. You can do a hand recount, so you're counting ballots in a different way than what it was tabulated, right? But the way countywide voting is set up, what Beth says, is that you are dependent on the machines telling you where your ballots are. So it's not really a thoroughly hand-counted method of tabulating, so that you're doing something totally different from the way it was originally tabulated. So it's funny that people say that's the backup, but then you're dependent on the machines telling you how many ballots, and then you stop. And that doesn't make sense because you're really not tabulating it properly, hand counted. Okay, so that's one thing I just wanted to say based on what she was saying. So that's the funny thing about people saying, oh, we have a hand count backup. Okay, so in terms of, Phil, your question about, why were we trying to do this? Well, we talked about, there are all these different things that we think are good for election integrity. I'm going to use that phrase, election integrity, where and precinct-based voting is one of those principles that we, or one of the methods to achieve this accuracy, reliability, transparency. Other is hopefully casting your vote in your precinct on a hand-marked paper ballot, filling it out, and having it counted right there, and having your results right then and published, so that it's all contained, very tight chain of custody. So that's, the pie in the sky, what we would like to go for, and also limit or eliminate the early voting period where a lot of issues can happen, but that, we want to go back to like a one-day election day. But in order to advance this goal, you have to take some steps, and it's incredibly difficult. The whole system, election system, the governmental system is actually works against going towards that, okay? So it's very difficult. So what we were trying to do with the Dallas County Republican Party, it's a very important issue for Republican voters, and it's an important issue for all voters, but for sure it's been poll after poll, looking at Republican voters, they are very concerned about this. So it was an avenue to do it, because in the primary, the Republican voters and the Republican Party has control over the primary more than general elections. General elections are under the control of the county governance, which are the county commissioners. And if they aren't interested in doing any of this, then really we have no power to do it, okay? And then otherwise, the legislatures in Austin need to make some major changes, and that just isn't happening. But right now in the Texas Election Code, it allows a party to have more control over their primary. So we thought this was going to be a good avenue to try to make some steps towards what we'd like in terms of election integrity through our primary. So that was really the impetus of trying to change. And really the party, according to Texas Election Code, really has more power over their election day than early voting. It's kind of weird. In the Texas Election Code, early voting has different laws governing it than election day. And the party has more power over election day than early voting. And on early voting, you can't eliminate countywide voting in the election code, but you can for election.
Okay. Very interesting. Now talk about this difference between having a separate primary and a joint primary. What is that difference?
Beth, do you want me to take this?
Yeah, you go.
Okay. So, a primary is meant for a party to select their candidates to go into a general election, right? And so historically, they've been separate. Like you have, Republicans have their, elections, they pick their folks, and then they go on to a general election, and then the Democrats do the same thing. So historically, these processes were separate, different, meaning you have, in the Republican primary, you have the people running their polling locations are Republicans, and then it's Republican voters coming in, and and they're not, we don't register as Republican or Democrat, but it'd be people who are voting on a Republican ballot. So who want to vote for a Republican ballot, they go to a Republican vote center. There are Republicans running that vote center, and then that's what a primary is. But in 2022, and in the Texas Election Code, you're allowed as parties, if you want to, you can agree to do a joint primary where you basically give all power to the county and you decide you're going to just run these elections together. So at the vote center, different voters who are voting Republican ballots, Democrat ballots, they go into the same vote center, they go to the same check-in. The personnel there can be a mixture of Republicans and Democrats, both the election judges and the clerks. And then the tabulators are all together, so your votes are all on the same USB. The paper ballots that get dropped into it, they're all mixed together, and then they all go to central count, and all the data is processed together at central count, and then it's published kind of separately, okay? But so that's what joint is. But in joint, when you do a joint primary, you do give up a lot of powers to the election department, the elections administrator, election department. They are running the whole show, and you've kind of given up a lot of those powers to the county. In a separate primary, there's a lot more of that power that the party retains to run their election, particularly on election day. And in addition, sometimes there can be a little bit of difficulty with, the different party personnel working together. And so sometimes it's not, it's nice to have a separation of that so that, people, don't have to interfere with each other, and you can just kind of run your own election. So that's been helpful. And where the voting locations have to be for a separate primary, they don't have to be in the same physical location. They can be in totally separate buildings. But they can also decide to share certain vote locations, and one's on one side, one's on the other. So that's kind of what the difference between a separate and a joint primary are.
And I want to add something to that. In the structure, at least in Dallas County, when you have a joint election, they set us up for a lot of potential conflict, because now you have co-judges, judges, meaning each of the judges, the Democrat and the Republican, have equal power. And I want to be quick to say, in my case, I had no trouble with my co-judge. We had worked together in previous years when I was a judge and she was the alternate judge. I had no trouble, but there were a lot of difficulties in the county where the two judges who had equal power had very different opinions. And one ended up dominating the other one, or there were some not so insignificant fights, verbal, and maybe even worse. So it was just a setup for a lot of potential conflict that's just not wise. You should not have to put your election officials in that place. Now, I want to say one more thing. There's some pushback to how we used to do it, which is separate election, and there was pushback on March 3rd. There was pushback even before 2019 when we had separate elections, because if you were sharing a location, the voter would come in the front door and someone would have to say, if you want to vote a Democrat ballot, you go over here. If you want to vote a Republican ballot, you go over there. And often, not the majority, but occasionally, the not so silent minority would go, oh, I don't want to tell you how I'm voting. Why do you ask? I want it to be secret. One person actually on March 3rd said, well, if I do that, then my husband's going to know how I'm voting. And I said, that's a you problem. That is not a county problem. But people forever have this, this idea of secrecy. I want to keep my party secret. Well, they can only do that in the state of Texas because we have open primaries. So they should consider themselves somewhat privileged. But here's the irony. What they don't know is when you have, joint primaries, but more so when you have countywide voting, your ballot choices, not just your party selection, but your ballot choices are not guaranteed to be secret or private. And in March 3rd, during the early voting period, countywide early voting, March 3rd, or the March 3rd election, there were over 9,000 ballots in Dallas County whose selections were known. We knew the names of the people. We knew how they voted. Over 9,000. So people I think they just don't realize that's what countywide gives you. And so maybe, Preeti, we need to start letting people know, you're very particular about which party, you're associated with. You want to keep that private. Well, do you want to keep your ballot choices, your candidate choices private? Because the best way to do it, the only way to do it, is precinct-only voting, unless you're the only one in your precinct who shows up to cast a ballot. And if you think you're the only one, you should run out and get a neighbor and get at least one more person to cast a ballot, and then nobody knows, right? But the only way you can guarantee the constitutional right to privacy of your ballot is precinct voting.
Okay, so explain that more, how that plays out. So basically you're saying with county-wide voting, there's the potential for your ballot not to be secret, for it to be revealed how you're voting, because you're voting at a location where you might be the only voter from your precinct voting at that location. So when it's tabulated, then that's identified as you. Or how does that work, that these ballots are unmasked?
So and it's not like we actually know. And she was saying the greater we. You would have to actually do some work to figure this out, but it's knowable. And the issue is just what you hit upon, Phil, is that when there are certain legal reports that have to be published by the Texas Election Code, which allows us to have some transparency and auditability of our elections. There's also a certain amount of information that can be obtained through public information requests. That's part of the law, and you should be able to do it. And that's also part of having a transparency and be able to audit. But then when you couple that with county-wide voting, where voters from different precincts who have different ballot styles and can vote in different races can end up going to multiple locations. And the more locations you have, the more this happens. So in Dallas, in general, we have like 450 sites on election day. That means these people from different precincts are going to all these different vote locations, and it starts to be easy to be able to figure out who they are and how they voted. And based on those, coupling the reports and the public information, and with that, people going everywhere. And it's funny, this kind of came to light a few years back. It started getting some publicity on this problem, and so there were some hearings in Austin, Senate hearings, etc. And the funny thing is that what the legislators want to do, or at least the election departments and the SOS want to do, is maybe redact certain reports. Okay, so we'll just redact reports. And that actually then precludes auditability and transparency. And the funny thing is, the people who redact, the redactors still know. Just the public may not be able to know if they redact information from reports, but the redactors still know. So intrinsically, there's a violation of anonymity. And I thought a better solution, if they realize this would happen, is A, go back to precinct-based voting, or B, they need to do a public service announcement to all the voters and saying, your ballot's anonymity is violated, so you should probably just be trying to vote at your precinct and trying to get everyone to vote, so you're in that group of people with the same ballot style. But of course, they didn't warn. They don't warn voters that is one of the many repercussions of countywide voting. And so, yeah.
And I want to go back to something, because I love the way you said it. It is knowable. It is knowable. In addition to that, though, we do know, even March 3rd, we do know of some of those ballots. We know some names of people that are familiar to me.
From the early voting.
From the early voting. And I do know the person who knows how they voted. I didn't ask. I don't care. But I think it was 2 years ago, when Matt Rinaldi's ballot was publicized. It was actually, I think, copied and put out there on social media, and it was an embarrassment.
This is the chair of the statewide party.
Yes.
Right.
And there are some not so insignificant public figures whose ballots are known. So it is knowable, but there are some that are known right now to this day. But Beth Beasel doesn't know. I know some of the names. I don't know how any of them voted because I just didn't care to ask. But the bigger point is what Preeti said. It is knowable and it's not hard. But redaction is not the answer. And I happened to be at that Senate hearing, and I was one of the ones testifying, and I was sitting beside some Secretary of State people, and they started talking about redaction, and I begged them, don't do that, because that diminishes transparency to zero. And again, as Preeti said, they may redact that information from us, but not from the redactors or not from the bad actors. And there are bad actors. There are bad actors. And I want to just say this quickly. There are bad actors. Name me, I don't think you or anybody in your audience could name one large enterprise, one government facility, one military facility, one large industry or educational institution or government institution that has not been hacked. And I'm talking about major facilities that have unlimited resources and budgets to secure their data center. They've all been hacked. Everybody gets hacked. Are we literally supposed to believe that there are no bad actors out there? And if there are bad actors, none of them actually want to manipulate an outcome of a race? I mean, you're dreaming if you think that's the case. And you're dreaming if you think these little old election computers that are made in China with telet modems in the tabulators that put it out there on the internet, where the government actually put the Albert sensor on there in the name of security. We're combing your network just to make sure that there's no bad actors there. I was born at night, but it was not last night. So if you can see in, you can get in and do things. And so the government is in our computers. They are accessing it through, I don't know if it's Wi-Fi, internet, Bluetooth, or some alphabet soup, network protocol that I don't know about, but they're in there. It is accessible. Do you really think that nobody actually has any intention to harm us by changing the outcome of a particular race?
No, there's a lot of motivation when there's big decisions at stake, and the stakes are high. A lot of people have incentive to do these things, and so it sounds like really, we want secure elections that are trustworthy for people, and it sounds like a big part of that is this voting in precincts, because it is more secure. You have the secrecy of the ballot. You have transparency where you want transparency. You want auditability. So this was the decision then of the county Republican Party to go back to precinct level voting on election day. So why was that decision made? And then we can talk about what happened.
So I can go with that question. So as we talked about, there are different goals. To get to election integrity, there are different things that we want to happen. And initially, the Dallas County Republican Party, we were working towards trying to do in-precinct, hand-count paper ballots like we had talked about a little while ago. That we think that would be much closer to what we would want to do. And we worked on that all of last year, and in the end it was very difficult to get an acceptable contract with the county, because in a big county, the party, even though as a separate primary we have full control, especially over election day, of how we want to run it, we have to depend on the Dallas County Election Department as a contractor for us to help run a lot of the logistics. And so, I mean, it's untenable to build your own logistical infrastructure to run an election like that. You have to depend on the county and have a contract with the county. And we had a lot of negotiations. We made a lot of headway in those negotiations, but we were unable to get finally a contract that we found acceptable to really make sure that we could do it in a responsible fashion. So we abandoned that idea at the end of December of 2025. But we had a backup plan of, even if we had to go to the machine voting, that we would still have a separate primary, which then allows us to have this control over our primary election day and then make it precinct based. So at least we can make that big step forward towards election integrity. So that's what we decided to do, and signed a contract with the county to help us implement that. And we signed that on December 31st, 2025. And that was what we then moved forward with for the March 3rd election.
So that is then different from what had happened before, where people could vote on election day at any location. Is that correct? That's what
Correct.
countywide voting is go to
Correct.
any location.
Up to 2018, if you look back, and you can even look back at the Dallas County Election Department website, if you look back at 2018 at the primaries, they were separate. In 2018, they were separate, and the Republicans had different polling locations, the Democrats had different polling locations, some of them were shared, and so it was precinct based, and for their runoff as well. So that was 2018. It was starting in 2019 that it started to become county-wide vote locations where people voted everywhere. And then in 2022 and 2024, we became joint. So joint and county-wide. So what we wanted to do is basically go back to the way we were doing it in 2018, okay? And so that's what we were moving forward with for the election. And then we can go on whenever you want to talk about some of the
I want
problems.
to throw in just very briefly. We looked at doing paper ballots, hand counting for early voting, as well as mail ballot. Well, mail ballots are paper, but we felt that we had the highest chance of success at just taking on election day, and we felt like that was the biggest bang for the buck. So that's why we settled on, instead of doing hand counting for all three different election codes, 3 different ways to vote, mail ballot or absentee, I should say, or early voting in person or election day voting, those 3 different ways to vote, we just felt like we couldn't take on all 3. And we wanted to get the biggest bang for the buck and have the highest degree of success. And that's why we chose election day. And the party has much more control. As Preeti said, we don't have control over pretty much anything for countywide voting. That is run by the county. And so that would be sort of foolish to try to do hand counting paper ballots when we just didn't control really anything in early voting.
Okay, and yeah, when you say countywide voting, you're referring to the early voting, and that has to be countywide?
Yes.
Correct. According to the Texas Election Code, basically pretty much from when early voting was implemented decades ago, it's been countywide.
Okay.
So a voter can vote. It used to be in some of the smaller counties, they have one voting location, and just it's for a few people who need to vote early, and they would go to that one voting location called the main polling location. And then they started having these like temporary branch polling locations in early voting, and it just got more and more expanded. Now in Dallas, we have like 72 or something early voting locations, and they are countywide. And per the law, they have to stay countywide, where voters can vote anywhere.
Okay. And is the early voting also joint? Or it was separate, actually?
It was, so we asked for it to be separate, and that's why we had it separate. But in the, like I said, in 2022 and 2024, when both parties signed the joint elections contract with Dallas County Elections, what that means is giving them the power. They make it joint. The elections are kind of combined for early voting and for election day. What we decided to do was to have it separate for early voting, but still we can't determine countywide. It's going to be countywide, and separate for election day, but we could determine that they would be precinct based, assigned precinct, and they're in combined precincts, as we call them.
Okay, and the county did combine precincts when the new elections administrator came in shortly before the election. The county went through a process of combining precincts.
So I think you're talking about redistricting. Are you talking about redistricting? So that's
Correct.
a different concept than the combination. So yes, the new election administrator came in October 1st of 2025. And the redistricting was finalized and voted on by beginning in December of 2025. And that just means like new boundaries for different races, new boundaries for different races. But that's different from the concept I was mentioning. I just threw it in there, but it's a different concept called combining precincts. So, historically precinct-based voting was every precinct just voted in their precinct. So we have like 790 some odd precincts in Dallas County with the new redistricting. And that would mean so you would have a polling location in every single one, okay? But that's not really how it's been done in the recent past, and that's not how we did it this time. This time we combine small precincts into a maximum number of registered voters, 5,000 or so. So you can put 4 or 5 together, and then you have a polling location within that combined precinct, and each of those precincts have to go vote at that. So it's an assigned voting location. They can't go anywhere. They have to go to that, but it's within a combined. So we were able to have 293 voting locations because we had 293 combined precincts. So
Okay, thank you. So then let's talk about the problems and what happened. So I'm imagining that if people are used to countywide voting over the last number of election cycles, then in their minds, it's election day, I can go to the place on the way to work that I've gone to the last few times. And then I get there and they say, no, actually, you have to vote in your precinct. Is that essentially what happened, or what happened on election day?
Well, if you're leaving your house and planning to vote first thing in the morning on your way to work, that pretty much implies that you're voting near your house, in your precinct. So, that's the ideal. You want to vote on your way to work, vote near where you live. Instead of going to work across town and then deciding at lunch, oh, I think I'll go vote, somewhere near where I'm taking my lunch, near Hot Dotties or whatever, for lunch. So ideally, and this is what happened all the time in precinct voting before 2019 when I was a judge, my line, I'd have 45 people standing in line at 7 a.m. because they're on the way to work. They wanted to stop in their neighborhood on their way to work. They go vote. The lines go fast. It's very, very, very efficient. But they'd be out there waiting because, they were on their way to work. Or then maybe at 8 o'clock, you'd have another wave of moms who were on their way to take their kids to school. And then in the afternoon, you'd have the moms who are coming home from school, or closer to 6, the business, the people who are at work coming home. Okay, I'm going to vote in my neighborhood. So that is the ideal scenario, and that's what people did without complaining a bit. Nobody complained. By the way, let me say this: nobody complained before, but during the times of precinct voting, up until we switched in 2018. Nobody complained. This whole countywide thing was not a market-driven solution. It was a top-down solution. There was no market demand for countywide voting. And that is important. When you have a solution that's driven from the top down, I just can't think of a single benefit or advantage. But it does teach people to be lazy because they can forget to vote. They can show up at 5 till 7, and go, I forgot, but I don't have to be responsible because I can go anywhere, anytime, right? So we are actually dumbing down our population, our citizenry. We're taking away that inner sense of responsibility by making things so darn convenient. You can just do it anywhere, anytime, anyhow. And that is not good for a citizenry. That does not make us a strong people. But people never complain about it.
Yeah, particularly if it detracts from the security and auditability of an election, because you want it to be accurate. But to what you were saying, Phil, in terms of, yes, people did vote this way, but how did we make sure? Because we all wanted to make sure that people understood that there was a change. Okay, so yes, of course, they've been voting this way in the primary the last few times, since 2019, and so when we made this change, we contracted with the Dallas County elections. We, meaning DCRP, the Dallas County Republican Party, contracted with the Dallas County Election Department to notify voters. And they actually had a whole budget to spend on sending mailings to voters and to send text messages to voters. Now, I know people personally who didn't receive these, but they were supposed to go to all registered voters in the county. And I received it personally. It was a mailer to say, hey, we're doing it differently this time. go to this website, go to the Dallas County Election Department website, and find your voting location. And I know I always do this anyway, even when it was precinct-based voting or even countywide voting. The day before I'm just going to go vote, I look up on the website to see the vote locations. And when you're assigned, you can then find out where you're assigned. But even when you're not assigned, you can't just assume, because sometimes there are things happen with those voting locations, the facility, there's something happening, they're doing construction or whatever, and they change voting locations sometimes. So people honestly shouldn't be just assuming a vote location is going to be open for them to go to. So, really they should be looking the day before and checking where they're supposed to go. So anyway, there was this massive campaign, okay? And then we had a link on the Dallas County Republican Party website of people could put their address in, and they would see where they're supposed to go if they want to do the Republican ballot. The Dallas County Election Department as well. If you're a Republican ballot, you can put your address in. You find where the Republicans vote. Democrat, same thing. But it didn't go that way. That would have worked incredibly well. Maybe some people would have gone to one location. They would have been redirected, okay, to another location, and that's fine. But there were more issues than even, you can explain by just someone going to the location they normally go to and then realizing they have to go somewhere else. And those problems stem directly from some mismanagement and wrong information on from our governmental entities. So the Dallas County Election Department, I guess, were overzealous, maybe in terms of wanting to, make sure people knew where to go. But they unfortunately propagated wrong information. They had navigators outside of certain polling locations, and they gave the voters wrong information. The SOS, the Secretary of State, some people went to the Secretary of State's website, and they got wrong information. Some people got text messages from unknown groups that said, go, this is where you're supposed to go, and go to the Secretary of State's website and check. And so that was wrong, and then they go to the Secretary of State's website, and that's wrong. So there was some that type of confusion occurred through actual misinformation. And right now, we don't really understand where that stemmed from. Why was there either wrong programming, wrong information? Where did that come from? Is it, just errors, incompetence, sabotage? We don't know.
And I want to add to this list, I'm going to pile on. So as I said, I was election day. So my poll books, the no ink poll books, also had bad programming. And I'm using that term because that's what the highest level at our Secretary of State's office over our elections division used that term, bad programming, or programmed incorrectly. If I scanned in the name of a voter and it came up wrong location, I had to figure out, by the way, I was never trained in training on how to do this, but I figured it out. You push a button to figure out what vote location this voter is supposed to go to. So it comes up with a page, go here. You can even put the voter's mobile number in there and text them that location with a nice little map, nice little address. But I can't remember why I did this, but I guess just, playing around with the system, that on that page, all that information, when you press or click on the name again, up pops another vote location for that voter to go to. Like, wait, the page before said go to place A. And I pressed, click on the voter's name again. Now it's saying go to place B. And I would go back and forth. And so we were told, that's bad programming. So don't use your poll book anymore to figure out where a voter goes. Send them out to the two people out front called navigators. Each one of the navigators had an iPad. Well, they had bad data as well. But even more inefficiently, there was a Republican navigator who had only Republican locations. So he'd have to flag down the Republican voters. If you're a Republican voter, come over here. Let me tell you where I'm going to send you. Pretend this is my iPad. Okay, and you click on it. Well, they had bad data too. Now, up until about 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon, each of the navigators only had either Democrat or Republican locations, which I think is terribly inefficient because you might have 10 people waiting in line behind the Republican guy, nobody behind the Democrat guy. My location was more Republican. Well, finally, somebody figured out that didn't work, and then they remotely reprogrammed, or I don't know what they did, but they allowed each iPad to have both Democrat and Republican locations on there. But it felt kind of chaotic because the information, we weren't trained on how to find somebody on our poll book, but then we, would stumble on it. And then you get two different pages, go here, no, go there, and then the navigator's information. But I want to be quick to say, Dallas County Republican Party website had the correct information. But guess what?
Well,
I did not, as a judge, I didn't know to go there. I didn't know that our Republican County Party website had correct information. So I never went there I never looked there. I never sent my voters to go there. So there was all this great data right there on the Dallas County Republican website. We did it correctly, but I never knew it was there, so I couldn't send anybody there. Preeti, do you remember that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the funny thing about the navigators was A, they maybe weren't trained properly, and B, to have them have iPads that some of them had ones that were just Republican or just Democrat didn't make sense because there were some polling locations that were just Democrat. And if they didn't necessarily have the functionality to be able to send a Republican to the right place, they were telling some people, well, this is the only place listed for you to come. And so some of those voters would just vote, maybe potentially were just voting at a Democrat location on a Democrat ballot, not really understanding that that's not really the ballot that they had wanted to vote on.
Yes.
So that was like another layer of issue. So somehow the process wasn't thought through, planned, and tested properly prior to the election, because this has been done before. Dallas County's done this before, but somehow they didn't have an implementation of a plan properly, and that caused many of the problems.
And I also want to add this. I keep reading this term mass chaos, mass confusion, and that is just not the case at all. It was not mass chaos and mass confusion. There was wrong data, and people did have to go to as many as 3 different vote locations. Interestingly, I only had 1 or 2 people that were pretty ticked off. There were many of my voters, or they turned out not to be my voters, but they came in thinking of them to be my voters. And I would apologize and I would say, look, we chose security, transparency, auditability over convenience. And then I would say, I'm so sorry it's inconvenient for you. By and large, the majority of the people that I spoke with that came into my polling place said, no worries, I am determined to vote. I'll go to the 3rd place. Just tell me where to go. There was not this mass angry outburst, but I will say this, and it looks like I have a bug on my screen. I want to get that off. Sorry. The Democrats came in first thing in the morning angry before anything ever started, so that if there was any mass confusion or mass anger or mass chaos or whatever, they started out that way. They wanted to hate it. They were mad they had to do it. And remember, Preeti, in our contract, when we were negotiating with the attorney, we said, hey, we don't care if they do countywide. Let them do countywide. Just let us do precinct only voting, which is our legal right to do it. We don't care. We offered that, but the Secretary of State's office said, no, it's the law. They have to do it. But Phil, I'm making the point that there was no mass chaos and mass confusion. There was confusion. There was bad data, but most of my voters or potential voters, most of the people that came into my polling place were frustrated but determined and said, don't worry about it. I'll go to the 3rd place. There were only 1 or 2 people who exhibited, a level of anger that you really felt bad about. But it wasn't mass anything except for the Democrats. I don't know if you heard this when you just came in. They started angry first thing in the morning. They started angry during early voting because I also worked early voting. They started being angry then. So again, there's a gross misrepresentation of the attitude and atmosphere out there. And if bad data is the problem, going back to countywide voting isn't the solution. The solution is fix the problem, which is bad data, and don't break something else while you're at it. Because the principles of precinct voting stand strong. They have not been broken. So don't break it. Don't break the precinct voting virtues while you're trying to fix the real problem, which is bad data. Incompetence, nefarious, we don't know, we don't care. Just fix it. And it's an easy fix. It is an easy fix.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I think all voters, probably even the Democrat voters, if they, once they were explained and understood what the rationale is, were very much for it, right? And then the basic level of potential confusion, as you mentioned, just because we're changing the system back, that is a low level, and then the heightened level is because of bad data, which can be fixed. And also, as people understand now, based on this one, for let's say the runoff, that we can correct these issues. That can be corrected. I think with the Democrats, some of the issues for their sides, both sides had record turnout for a non-presidential primary, regardless of what happened with any kind of confusion. We had record turnout. We had 104,000 voters who voted total in our election, relative to like an 89,000 in last non-presidential, and the Democrats blew it out of the water. And I think probably some of their frustration was also just their lines, because maybe there wasn't as much, when the election department is trying to allocate machinery and other supplies, etc., they have to do some kind of estimation of what the turnout's going to be, and maybe they didn't estimate properly, I don't know, and so they had bottlenecks probably on their side, on the Democrat primary, like with their personnel or machines or whatever. So I think that contributed to their frustration, just because maybe there was a misallocation of
definitely machine. In early voting, in the location I shared with the Democrat sites with the Democrats, they should have had way more poll books and way more voting machines, because their lines were terrible. My lines weren't that bad because in early voting where I was working, that's not a heavily Republican turnout location. But the allocation, I think, was not well done at all.
Right.
And even they couldn't pivot to correct, like bring out more poll books or more voting machines during the day, and they're going to blame it on, well, it's because of this precinct voting election or whatever. They're going to blame it on something else. I want to add one more thing to get this on the record, if you don't mind. You asked what some of the problems were, and nobody's talking about this. And so I want to get it out there to see if anybody else had this problem. I had some voters who came in. They weren't in my poll book. They were in the wrong precinct. But they wanted to vote a provisional ballot because they just didn't have time to go somewhere. They didn't want to go somewhere else. They just wanted to say they voted. I could not give them a provisional ballot, which is the first time ever when I've been an election judge during precinct only voting on election day. I've always been able to give a provisional ballot, even if you're in the wrong vote location, wrong precinct. It's a HAVA violation to turn away a voter and not give them the opportunity to fill out a provisional ballot. And I was told by one of the personnel officers at the Dallas County Election Department that I could not offer a provisional ballot. And that is a HAVA violation. And I kept saying, why? You've always trained us. We can never turn away a voter. And the response was, well, because the Republican party's voted to do precinct only voting. I said, that doesn't matter. We're always supposed to, by law, offer provisional ballot. And then they repeated the same thing over and over and over and over. And so that needs to be fixed. And it just is another indicator that people at the county elections department weren't happy with us, and that we're going to make it as difficult as possible, cause as many problems as possible. I don't think this was incompetence, because this particular individual is a very smart individual, but didn't want to play ball, didn't want to help, just wanted to make it as hard as possible. And that's not okay. But the idea that the solution is to go back to countywide voting, we'll never get this, as they say, well, let's just wait till 2028, we'll try again. No, we'll never get the opportunity again, because people never trust us again. We will have lost that trust, and this decision to amend the contract was done outside the law, should have never been done, but it was foolish because it doesn't fix the root problem. And people, when they bump up against complaints or concerns or backlash or what have you, where's the staying power? Where's the inner fortitude? Just take your lumps and go, I know that was really hard. If we could have done better, they could have done better. We're going to do better next time, because the principles of precinct voting have not been broken. They stand strong, and they need to be protected. And it's a pretty big step towards transparency, auditability, accountability, accessibility, and strengthening the power of the precinct, the most basic form of self-government, which we should value.
Yeah, it just strikes me, voters were not in the habit of precinct voting. They had gotten out of that habit. While this was a dramatic way, if you're ignoring the mailings that you're getting, if you're not checking your polling place, well, now for the next election, and you're highly aware, well, I got to know where I'm voting, and a lot of the problems should be ironed out. But for the runoff election, like you were referring to, the contract has been amended. So talk about that. What is happening with the runoff election?
Preeti?
Well, so, the CEC, which is the County Executive Committee, which is the governing body of the county party, the CEC has the power over conducting and supervising their primary election. Because remember, this is a primary. This is for people who are interested in actually selecting the party's representatives who will be candidates in the general election, right? So these are, in general, there are people who are more informed, more interested in really being involved in the grassroots of the party. And so the County Executive Committee has the authority to create and sign a contract with the Dallas County, with a vendor, which is our county elections officer. And so that happened on December 31st, 2025. And that's what we were working. And that contract included the runoff. Usually those election contracts are for the primary and for the runoff. It includes both. And so that was stipulated in that contract that we would do separate primaries and precinct-based voting on election day. And so that's the contract that we were working under for the election. What's happened subsequently is that the County Executive Committee did not reconvene and have a debate or a vote about reverting back to countywide voting. That did not happen. The county chair, however, decided to sign an amended contract without having that debate and discussion and vote from the County Executive Committee. So kind of unilaterally without the CEC, who is actually the contracting authority. So that is a bit of a problem right now, because there's
going backwards. It's going backwards.
A difference of opinion, and it's going backwards. I mean, honestly, as Beth said, I don't understand. I personally don't understand why that's the solution. Like, if you have these problems, we need to address what actually the problems were, but not go backwards on our principles and our beliefs of what when we were trying to move forward. And a lot of work. It took a lot of work to get to that point, to get to that contract, to move this ball forward. A lot of work all last year and for years of work of election integrity folks in the party to work towards this. So it doesn't make sense in my mind to go back to a worse form of election because there were these specific problems that can be addressed and can be addressed quite quickly. For the runoff. So it is a little bit confusing to me as to why that decision was made.
And we keep hearing this retort of fear of lawsuits, fear of being sued. Well, we know we did everything legally correct. There was no voter suppression, which is the low-hanging fruit for a lawsuit, because there was record turnout. So what's driving this? And there was on March 16th, the CEC did convene. A motion was supposed to come up. The chair was not there to make the motion. The person that was supposed to make the motion didn't. There was an opportunity to do it the right way. If the motion had been made and passed to go back to countywide for the primary runoff on election day, you know, you lick your wounds and go, wow, that stunk, but you move on because it was done in the right way. But it wasn't done in the right way. And that also makes you wonder, what's the force behind this? And when do we not do something because we're afraid of a lawsuit? If we lived by that, we would never get out of bed in the morning. I'd certainly never get on the highway. You know, I mean, that's an accident waiting to happen. So, you know, what's the driving force here? And like you've both said, it takes us backwards, way backwards.
And one thing, I don't really know the thought process that our chair went through because he really hasn't had that conversation with the party at large. But I do know that there are many people from a state level down who, and probably from a country level nationally, who are really trying to push the primaries to be joint and to be countywide. And the question is why? Ostensibly, they like to say, oh, it's convenient, maybe there's a little bit of cost savings or something. But it's funny, in Dallas County, if you look at the numbers, there was no increase in voter turnout after countywide was implemented. Okay, so if that's the argument, that's not really an argument for Dallas County. And then in terms of cost, there may be like a little bit more cost, and we're talking about machine voting, right? And we do know that if we went to paper and all of that, it would be a lot less expensive. I almost guarantee that, but we're in the machine world. So maybe there's a little bit more expense, but not a whole lot more expense for a better form of election, more secure. I mean, there needs to be some value put on an accurate and transparent election. And if we're moving in that direction, maybe some little expense is important. But for some reason, the powers that be want to keep it joint and keep it countywide. And the question is why, you know?
Okay, very interesting.
When you keep it countywide and then the joint, you're diluting the integrity of the ballot, but you're also, over time, you're centralizing the voting process, and the ballot becomes farther and farther and farther away from the voter. Accessibility, accountability, audibility, transparency, whatever, it all gets farther and farther away. And what we also happen to know is that mobile voting on your cell phone, is right around the corner. It's been in beta test, and now I forgot what state, Utah or somewhere, they've already proposed it. But I think it's Utah. But anyway, somebody will fact check us. Mobile voting, no judges, no clerks, no poll watchers, no precincts. Just you do your thing on your phone, and then the government will report who won and who lost. So, you know, this is getting to be utter nonsense. And I want to add this too. When you have election results that the citizenry cannot trust, that is a very destabilizing factor for any nation state. You have to have elections whose results you trust. So we're going down the wrong road here.
No, absolutely. And, this whole push towards joint primaries and countywide, because these joint elections, they increase our dependence on the election department and on the elections administrator. And you've lost, and we've seen with our party and maybe with the Democrat Party, you lose expertise in being able to run election. You enhance dependence on the county, and you lose engagement by the party and people in the party in terms of understanding how elections work, working on the elections, really taking ownership of that. So it weakens the party, and the voters, and it enhances dependence on the county. And then countywide voting is explicitly you're dependent on machines. So regardless of a small county or a large county, if you go to countywide voting, you pretty much have to have voting machines, electronic voting machines, to be able to print ballots, to do poll books, to see where people are voting. Like they cause that dependence, and you wonder why that's being pushed so hard.
Wow, that's fascinating. Okay, so I'm wondering. So looking ahead now, there's the amended contract that has been signed for the runoff. Questions about its legality, but then looking ahead to 2028, what are you seeing in terms of a push for election integrity? What do you think will happen? What do you think should happen?
Well,
go for it, Preeti.
From my perspective, there was a lot of work that went into getting us to this point with the Dallas County Republican Party. And I know myself and Beth, and Phil, you have as well, and others put a lot of effort. And we know that there's so much work in terms of legal maneuvering, negotiations, buy-in, just a lot of work that went into getting to this point. This is a huge setback if this happens. And personally, I think if it happens this way, where the precinct chairs have been neutered, because the precinct chairs and the county executive committee their main power is to help run their primary. Okay, otherwise you can be a volunteer and you can go do everything a precinct chair can do, but one of the powers of the precinct chair that the Texas election code gives the precinct chair is to help conduct and supervise their primary election. And if that power is getting taken away, and I know my issue is election integrity, and if I feel like I cannot forward that issue within the party, then I probably will disengage from that, because I want to be effective. And I want to effectively use my time. So, I know we've already been tossing around, do we need to have some outside activist group? I know Beth's been doing this a lot longer than me, and I know, unfortunately, it's a bit disheartening because different avenues we've tried have failed. But Beth can speak a little more.
Well, I think maybe, Phil, I would ask the question, what do you see coming up for November, for the general, November 2026, this year, the general? And maybe a little bit for the primary runoff in May. There's some races that are extremely important. And I happen to know there's some races on the ballot whose candidates really need to win Dallas County. And I think that precinct only voting on election day potentially could help the good guy, okay, the one we want to win. So I'm very concerned just about the outcome of what happens May 26th. So I really think this is a fight worth having to protect precinct voting. Not all fights are worth it. And we've been asked by certain people, can't y'all just get along? Can't y'all just stop fighting? Can't you just stop arguing? We just need to be unified. Well, two things can be true at one time. That is a true statement. We need to be unified. We need to, work together, stop arguing. But there are some fights that are worth having. There's some things that have so much value, they're worth preserving. And this is one of them, particularly in this primary where there are some pivotal runoff races. But then in November, I'm very concerned. I'm more concerned about what happens in November, really, than I am about what happens in 2028. And that is a whole nother can of worms we probably shouldn't totally open up. But to the degree that we gain some trust in precinct voting for this primary, maybe we will get more people engaged, and so they will turn out for the good Republican candidates in November, and we can preserve the majorities in the House and the Senate, federal races. But then for 2028, if we are able to preserve precinct voting, that is just one step towards election integrity. Then the hill to climb isn't quite as high in 2028 in that primary, because we will have already taught people how to do precinct voting. Now we just need to teach them how to sign up to be hand counters, to hand count ballots in the precinct. So it does get us there. And it is a lot easier to do a step-by-step approach. And actually, I am not an incrementalist. I am a Jenny bar the door, I'm a all or none. And my friends tell me, I've got this group of friends across the state, and they'll say, you are not an incrementalist. And that is true. However, I was blind, but now I see the incremental step of executing and protecting precinct voting is a very nice pathway to hand counting in 2028 primary. So it's worth the fight, and we're not going away. We're going to fight until the day is over to preserve what we have worked so hard for. And as we've all agreed, these principles, they've not been broken. So, and the solution is to fix the problem, fix the root problem. Preeti is a doctor. She doesn't just put a Band-Aid over a place on somebody's gallbladder when the gallbladder needs to come out because it's infected, or appendix or whatever. Right, Preeti? Dr.
Correct.
Preeti, you take it out. You address the root cause. And then maybe you
Correct.
tell the patient, you should probably stop eating all that fried chicken and whatever else you're eating, French fries, I don't know, truffle fries. But you fix the root cause and the root problem, and the fix is easy. And you just...
Yeah. We're not ones to brush things under the rug or kick the can down the road. That doesn't seem to have been working, since that's been the attitude for many people all along. We need to keep moving the ball forward, and
Yes.
so we believe in that strongly.
Well, gosh, this has been very illuminating. Thank you for articulating this. Elections are very complex. So getting in there and pouring your hours of time and your energy into this is inspirational. And especially a big thanks to you for coming on and walking people through it and explaining it, because I think the people listening to this who might have been wondering, what was that all about? What was that election all about? What was attempted to be accomplished? Laying that out for people is very helpful. So hopefully people will watch this, understand what's going on with our elections, which honestly, what could be more important? I mean, this is the foundation, cornerstone of our Republican form of government. And throughout history, there have been attacks on it, and voter fraud, and lack of trust and integrity. And it's people like you, really at the grassroots level, delving into it and spending the time and effort. And so that is inspirational. People who want to get involved should look at joining their local political party, being with like-minded people, and having an impact beyond just sending an email and making a call to elected representative. I mean, you are showing what Republican government is all about. So thank you for that. Thank you for being on today. Great to see you both. Keep up the good work.
Thank you so much, Phil.
Thank you. Thank you for having us on.